Welcome, everyone. Thank you very much for attending this panel at the 5:30 to 7 p.m. slot. We deeply appreciate it. We know it's been a long day for all of you, and thank you very much for coming. And I trust you'll find it very informative about really what U.S. oversight agencies can bring to the area of anti-corruption and our collective efforts. We hope to demystify what inspectors general are and what they do in the United States. And we also will hear on the programmatic side from our colleagues at the Millennium Challenge Corporation. So the objective of this session, let me first start with that before introducing panelists. But the objective of this session is to engage with civil society organizations and NGOs, journalists, and other donor organizations about how they, or how you all in the audience and in our virtual audience, can really engage to assess, monitor, contribute to, or replicate donor efforts. So bilateral or multilateral donor efforts to safeguard the integrity of programs, development programs, financing programs abroad, and work to prevent the loss of development resources to corruption due to fraud. And we'll talk again about the ways that we engage with civil society, with activists like yourselves, to intake reports of fraud, corruption, and other forms of abuse against U.S. programming. Let me first introduce our panelists. So I am the moderator and a panelist, serving two roles. My name is Adam Kaplan. I'm the acting general counsel and director of congressional public affairs for USAID's Office of Inspector General. So that's U.S. Agency for International Development, OIG. Next to me is Gladys Griffith, who is the Deputy Inspector General for the U.S. International Development Finance Corporation, IG. Next to Gladys is Jonathan Walls, who's the Deputy Inspector General of the Export-Import Bank of the United States, Office of Inspector General. To Jonathan's left is Shipa Vela, who is the Project Management Specialist for the MCC in the U.S. Embassy in Kosovo. And next to Shipa is Chris Williams, and Chris is the Senior Director for Anti-Fraud and Corruption at the Millennium Challenge Corporation, otherwise known as MCC. So, we discussed the objective, and I like to start with, what's the bottom line? What's the bottom line up front? Really, from the IG side, we are deeply, deeply committed to anti-corruption efforts, to protecting and ensuring the integrity of U.S. government funds, both domestically, that are spent domestically here in the U.S. and abroad, like all of our agencies where there is funding going abroad. And we are also, I'll use the word, deeply reliant on civil society, on individual reports of allegations of corruption, of fraud, of any general misconduct that could compromise U.S. government programming and U.S. taxpayer dollars. So we're going to talk about what it means to, first of all, we'll demystify the role of the Inspector General. What is an IG? What do we do? We'll talk about reporting obligations for both U.S.-funded contractors and NGOs. We'll talk about how we really welcome and encourage reports by civil society activists or individuals to Office of Inspector General, and what that means. What that means in terms of being a confidential reporter of allegations, and what it also means to what protections are in place for those who do choose to come forward under U.S. law. So we'll talk about that as well, and then we'll talk on the programmatic side about MCC's efforts to combat corruption within its programs. So really looking forward to this discussion. We welcomed President Biden's memo, his anti-corruption memo, the national security memorandum that's been discussed throughout this this conference, and it's really absolutely our bread and butter. So looking forward to the next hour and a half, and also to questions from you all, from the audience, both in the room and virtual. You can jump in at any time during our discussions, or you can save your questions to the end. But we're going to allow at least 30 minutes for Q&A, so please get your questions ready. With that, I will turn it over to Gladys.
Good evening, everyone. I'm so happy to see you here joining us this evening for what I hope will be an informative and lively session. A lot of my references, as basically Adam mentioned, I'm Gladys Griffith. I'm the Deputy Inspector General and General Counsel at the U.S. International Development Finance Corporation. My slides will say DFC generally, since our office prepared them, but what I'll talk about are basically how the offices of Inspector Generals operate generally. And there are 75 offices of Inspector Generals. We work collaboratively together very much. So we have different councils, like all the attorneys get together. We also have one with all the inspectors general themselves get together, councils of integrity and efficiency. We also have what is called the ignet.gov, and there you can access any Office of Inspector General. And I say all this more to let you know that we work very collaboratively as a community, so even if you don't know the right office to reach because you have an allegation of fraud, waste, you can go to any of them, and we will find each other and pass it on. We get references from each other all the time. So all you need to know is that we exist and what we do and how we work with you and rely on you to help us make sure that the funds that we invest go to the source and to where they're actually intended and make the good. So I will, with that, I'll get started with the slides. Hopefully they will behave for me. Next slide, please. No. They're not behaving for me. So what is DFC? DFC is the International Development Finance Corporation I mentioned. I'm going to talk about them very briefly because you may not have heard of them as they exist now. You may have heard of OPIC, which is the Overseas Private Investment Corporation, which was the predecessor for basically DFC. And Congress in America and a lot of folks felt that OPIC couldn't work as effectively and efficiency in having development and they could work more efficiently. So a law was passed, the Better Utilization of Investment Fund, BUILD Act, basically in 2018, and it basically it combines some of the USAID finance, credit, development part, along with some of the existing OPIC functions. And what it also did was create an Office of Inspector General, because before DFC dedicated to that specific organization. Because before that, USAID was the IG for OPIC, and they just have too many other things on their plate. They wanted to make sure that as Congress tripled basically the amount of potential investment for DFC to work with private investors, they want to make sure that they had an OIGA that can make sure the money is going where it's intended. So in addition to doing some of the function that USAID did, DFC also does a lot of direct loans and guarantee financing, equity investments with companies committed to development, investment funds to support emerging markets, political risk assurance, which is a big one, because, for example, with the rebuilding of Ukraine, there may be some hesitation by private investors to go in there, because what if everything goes to hell again, right? So this is where the political risk insurance comes in to help protect against losses, currency, government interference, political violence, war, terrorism, and also technical assistance is some of the focus. Next slide, please. And there is a focus specifically on small businesses, women entrepreneurship, climate and renewable energy is a big one. We've committed $7.4 billion to these efforts. Respect for environment, human rights, workers' rights is very important. Health resiliency, pandemic preparedness. We partnered with a lot of various organizations and countries to get vaccines out, for example. National policy and security concerns, and of course the biggest one right now for everyone is Ukraine, but there are a lot of other countries where we have made a focus. So what is the main tools OIGs use? Next slide, please. OIG audits are one of the big tools that we have, and basically the Inspector General Act, which is the act that applies to all of the OIGs, provides tools. So we can use subpoenas, we can use requests, and it gives direct authority to the Inspector General community, the auditors, the evaluators, inspectors, to access whatever documents they need from anyone receiving funds from the U.S. government. So we obtain the information, that way we can review, we have a right to access, and that permits us to review and see, are the funds being put to the use that which they've been said? How are the documents we've been provided actually true? Are they truly reflective of what needs to be done? And it helps us protect the asset and revenue of the government. It also helps with program integrity. We meet with folks on the ground. We go to the actual sites. We talk to folks who are receiving the funds, the small business entrepreneurs, to make sure, how are they being charged a fee? Is the fee exorbitant? We ask a lot of questions. Also, part of that, though, is the transparency. We have to keep our governance apprised, which means, and for DFC, we have a board of directors, but different organizations have different groups. There's basically they're reporting to Congress and to a leader, and they're not reporting to individuals within the organization because they need to have that independence, and that gives us that. And that's for all the OIGs. Similarly, for investigations, we have a right to access, which is really important under the IG Act, because a lot of time, because this is more having to do with fraud or abuses, there may be a tendency to get rid of evidence or not provide access. The law under which the Inspector Generals were created gives that right to access, or we have to notify Congress, and then Congress will step in. And Congress has the purse, so they have a little hand with agencies. Also, we conduct not just criminal, but also civil and administrative investigations. We look at any alleged violations of rule, law, or agency policy. We also protect assets and revenues like they do, and promote program integrity. So sometimes the investigation believes that maybe there's not wrongdoing, but perhaps there are some lack of processes to protect agency asset, and we'll make recommendations for that. Sometimes we'll do a very quick one-page alert, like this is a problem. You have a weakness in the system that may cause harm to the organization or harm to the assets that are an issue. So we also work with not just internally, we work with the Department of Justice, we work with prosecutors, we work with whomever we need, and internationally, we work across with the international organizations as well, like Interpol and others, to find who we need, and also to get the context for how things work in that country. And of course, we work with the Department of State as needed and let them know that we're in there and try to get some information. And as I mentioned earlier, we work with each other. So there's a very strong network within the Office of Inspector General community, so that if we're looking at one company, we can share that information with each other. And that way we can join forces and be even more effective, and maybe get some intel that we may not have had as well. And we keep a DFC OIG hotline, which we're going to talk about a little bit more. But most importantly is we protect whistleblowers. And we'll talk a little bit more on the panel about this, but I think that's probably our most important function. In fact, it's so important, there's an entire section in the Inspector General Act that is dedicated to the duty of the OIG to protect whistleblowers. And the whistleblowers it can be somebody who brings forward an allegation that they believe is true. So even if ultimately when we investigate, we find, that's not the case, the whistleblower is still protected because it was in good faith, they made that allegation. And we take this responsibility so seriously that we sometimes have either pursued an investigation in a different way or not pursued an investigation if the whistleblower's identity would be compromised. So I just want everybody to know that. And this protection extends to anyone who provides information related to government contracts, grants. So you can be a contractor, you can be a grantee, you can be a witness who's seen something, so that you will be protected under U.S. law. So, and we work with our partners overseas as well to protect you where we can. With that, I'll pass on to USAID OIG, who will talk a little bit more about it, and you'll hear back from me again during the session as needed. But this is sort of the big layout of what OIGs do, and then we'll talk a little bit more specifically on details. So looking forward to your questions later. Thank you.
Okay, I guess over to me. So again, Adam Calvin with USAID, Office of Inspector General. And look, Gladys's overview was very good, that the authorities that authorities under U.S. law apply to all IGs, and that allows us ability to access the information we need, especially from the agencies we oversee. And that's critical to help inform our audit work, the evaluations we do, our inspections, and certainly our investigations from an internal perspective. But I'll talk a little bit about how we interact externally and how we obtain information from our expectations for obtaining information from USAID-funded contractors and grantees, but also how we really rely on, these are disclosures, mandatory disclosures under an award term, but how we rely on individuals to really report information that may not come through to us from that individual's organization. So, to take a step back, I think most of you are familiar with USAID's work. USAID is the U.S. government's primary vehicle for humanitarian and development assistance across the world. And USAID IG, we are the independent oversight arm of USAID. So we are part of the organization, but we do not report to Administrator Power, who spoke eloquently yesterday on anti-corruption. That being said, when the Biden memo from June 2021, the National Security Memorandum came out, and it called specifically for the U.S. government to establish best practices and enforcement mechanisms such that foreign assistance has built-in anti-corruption measures. And from that, USAID created its own anti-corruption task force, of which OIG, the USAID IG, we participate on. And it's interesting seeing the memorandum and comments from the ACTF. It's really what we as an IG do every day. It's our bread and butter, is to, our mission statement is to safeguard and strengthen U.S. foreign assistance through timely and impactful oversight. So seeing the anti-corruption task force and seeing the President Biden's memorandum, it really is something when it comes to oversight of foreign assistance, what we do on it. It's part of our mission, it's part of our mandate, it's what Congress and certainly the American people expect from our office. And it can be oversight over some pretty tough environments in which USAID does business. And let me add real quick, we are also the IG for the Millennium Challenge Corporation at the end of the table. Millennium Challenge Corporation, Inter-American Foundation, and U.S. African Development Foundation, USADF, formerly OPEC until they became DFC. So, USAID Foreign Assistance Program, it occurs in like I said, very challenging environments. We have Afghanistan, Syria, Iraq, the Northern Triangle, and certainly last but not least Ukraine, where there's already over $1 billion in humanitarian assistance that's been obligated, with $13 billion in direct budgetary support to the government of Ukraine that's being administered through the World Bank. So I think we are unique in that respect, that our oversight efforts do really take on a very large international flavor. And how do we conduct oversight over programming in Afghanistan and Syria? And the bottom line is we rely a great deal on the transparency and the truthful timely reporting from organizations that USAID funds. So whether you're an NGO or whether you're a contractor, I start off by saying there's mandatory reporting obligations for aid organizations who receive USAID funds. And these reports have to come in through, they're submitted both to USAID through a contracting officer, agreement officer, but also to the Office of Inspector General, to us. And so the legal obligations are generally that contractors and grantees must disclose in a timely manner to both OIG and the agency allegations when there's credible allegations of fraud, corruption, abuse. And not so much when we don't want a disclosure coming in, 3 years later that there could be misconduct that compromises USAID programming. What we urge, if this was an audience of solely aid organizations, I would say the same thing, that we definitely expect from contractors and grantees that transparent reporting, even if it's uncomfortable. There are bad actors that do compromise any agency's programming, and it's incumbent on civil society organizations, on NGOs who receive our funds to lean forward in reporting allegations. It doesn't mean we're out there to we're not trying to put them out of business, certainly for reporting an allegation. And the more cooperation we receive initially from an NGO or contractor, the more we're going to trust that organization that even uncomfortable information should be disclosed to our office. And so, we talk about what's credible evidence. Credible is believable, we said. So again, lean into those disclosures if you're a recipient of U.S. government foreign assistance funds. That's the legal obligation for organizations. That's called a disclosure. Now let's talk about what a complaint is. A complaint is what we receive from individuals. And we really, there's an ethical obligation for federal employees. So if you work for USAID, if you work for Millennium Challenge Corporation and you notice fraud, waste, or abuse, you have a reasonable belief that there's some programs internally or operations have been compromised, you have to make that disclosure to the IG, and you have whistleblower protections for doing so that are available under U.S. law. If you're an individual outside of the government, like Gladys said, there are similar protections for employees of contractors or subcontractors or other recipients who, if they do choose to come forward, there's no mandatory obligation, but we really encourage that level. We rely on both organizations but individuals too to be our eyes and ears on the ground and to report instances where they believe programs have been compromised by bad actors and allow our organization at least to take the first crack at responding. And whether that results in a U.S. criminal case, a civil case, an administrative remedy like suspending and debarring bad actors so they don't just recirculate across the international aid sector, we'll assess allegations for all of those potential remedies. But sometimes what we get from organizations is a little bit different from what we receive from individuals. The organizations, will often go through, their legal counsel and, provide something, maybe a heavily sanitized version of what went wrong, say in South Sudan, report it to us and try to absolve themselves, organizationally or corporately, of all wrongdoing. And this is why we're out there we give fraud awareness briefings across the world, and we speak not only to the chief of parties of NGOs, the head of people in New York, DC, London, of the major NGOs. We'll speak to them, but we also speak to individuals who work for those organizations and reinforce their ability to come forward to us to make that complaint about corruption within our program, allowing us to respond. So we can go to, let me go to one previous slide. One other piece that's, we've dealt with individuals who will come to our office and say, we really want to report some potential fraud in affecting or compromising USAID programming, but we're under an NDA. Does everyone know what NDA? Non-disclosure agreement. And we're barred from our employer in South Africa from actually transmitting this information to to you as the donor or as the donor's oversight arm. And when I hear something like that, it's incredibly frustrating because that organization, no matter if they're an American organization, if they're wherever they are located, they are bound by the same restrictions on internal confidentiality agreements. So NDAs that do preclude activists or employees from coming forward to our organization are strictly prohibited. It's a material violation of that contract or grant that the organization is operating under. And while we'll say we can't guarantee that under local law, they won't try to enforce it, but if they do try to enforce it, they're going to have an issue with us. And it's completely unacceptable to have that sort of restriction, essentially a gag order on civil society, on individuals from coming forward and making a report to the Office of Inspector General. And we really depend on it in our operations across the world, and especially enforcing this with aid that is going into Ukraine. Again, that reliance and importance on individuals to come forward and report allegations of fraud and corruption. With that, let me turn it to John Walls, who will talk about hotlines and specifically how we intake and protect information.
Great. Good evening, everyone. Again, my name is John Walls. I'm the Deputy Inspector General at the Export-Import Bank of the United States, or XM. Before I get to the issue of hotline reporting and confidentiality, I wanted to just provide a brief overview of what XM is. I think it's perhaps not as well known as certainly USAID. So XM is the official export credit agency of the United States. There are about 70 of these export credit agencies worldwide, and they exist to provide financing to support domestic exports. In the case of XM, the agency's mission is to support the export of U.S. goods and services overseas. We are authorized by the United States Congress, or the agency is authorized by the United States Congress to extend $156 billion in lending authority, and that usually takes the form of several products. For example, the agency will give direct loans to foreign buyers of U.S. exports. So, for example, if an American company is going to build a power plant or purchase an American aircraft, XM in some cases will make those loans. We also issue loan guarantees and export insurance products as well. My office, the Office of Inspector General, was established in 2012 to provide that independent oversight of XM. And as Adam and Gladys have mentioned, while the mission of our agencies differ, kind of the way that OIGs operate is consistent across the government. And I wanted to just, as Adam mentioned, talk a little bit about some of the mechanisms that we use to get that information that's so important, particularly to our investigative activity, but also to our audits, inspections, evaluations, and really our efforts to ensure kind of good governance and work to improve and effectively oversee the programs and operations of the agencies that we're charged with overseeing. I wanted to talk a little bit about confidentiality. So confidentiality is something that we take very seriously. Just as U.S. domestic law has protections for whistleblowers, we also, OIG itself has an obligation to maintain the confidentiality of that. So if you actually move to the next slide. Can we use that? Pardon? Oh. Let's see. I think it'll catch up with me in a second here, but the IG Act does require that we protect the identity of individuals who provide us information. And there are basically two exceptions to that. One is in the case where an employee or a individual who provided us with information waives that confidentiality, or if the Inspector General determines that it's necessary to kind of reveal that information to protect an investigation. But as Gladys mentioned in her presentation, really working to protect that confidentiality is something that's important to us. And one of the ways that we do that is through our hotline. So all OIGs operate a hotline. I think if you look back at some of the previous slides, we've given links to ways that individuals who have a concern can make that information known. And in some cases, that's a phone number. In other cases, it's an email address or a web form. And in all of those cases, there is an opportunity to provide that information anonymously. And that helps us protect confidentiality. In some cases, people will, not report anonymously. That does sometimes help us pursue a more thorough investigation. But individuals who report typically would have an opportunity to report anonymously. So I think I'm going to turn it there. I'll stop there, and I think we'll turn it over to our colleagues at MCC.
Yes, over to MCC now, just to talk about how they programmatically work to reduce the risk of fraud and corruption within their programs and operations. So Shipa and Chris.
Great. Thank you very much. My name's Chris Williams. I'm the Senior Director for Anti-Fraud and Corruption at the Millennium Challenge Corporation. The first thing that we want to ask is, who here has heard of the Millennium Challenge Corporation? Oh, holy cow, that's more than I thought. That's great to see. Okay, so we are a U.S. government agency, even though our last name is corporation. Our mission is to reduce poverty through sustainable and inclusive economic growth. So we don't do humanitarian aid. We try to promote economic growth, of course, inclusive. We select the projects that we are going to fund by looking at what the binding constraints to economic growth are for a particular country. And Shipa will talk about the analysis that was done for her country of Kosovo. We also promote policy and institutional reforms that will make sure that our investments are sustainable after we finish funding the programs. Let's see. Next slide, please. So what makes MCC unique? One is our partners have to be selected. We have a board of directors that's chaired by the Secretary of State. The majority members are U.S. government officials. It includes the administrator of USAID, Samantha Power. And we have what's called a scorecard of 20 different indicators. And countries, in order to be eligible for our major grant program, what we call compacts, they have to pass at least half of those indicators. And importantly, they have to pass a particular indicator that is called the Control of Corruption Indicator. There will be a discussion about the Control of Corruption Indicator and selection and eligibility by MCC tomorrow, again at 5:30. So if you want more information on that, you can attend the session, or you can just go to our website, mcc.gov. We have a nice 50-page document explaining how this all works. We also have, because we pursue reduction of poverty through economic growth, all of our investments have to promote economic growth. So we have an economic rate of return, 10%, that all of our investments are supposed to meet. We have a strict 5-year clock for our major programs, the compact programs. Once they enter into force with a country, everything has to be done within 5 years. At the last day of the 5 years, they can no longer spend our money. That provides quite an incentive for the governments and for the contractors that the governments hire to get the stuff done. We don't have no-cost extensions like on USAID projects or World Bank projects. We focus on results. Everybody focuses on results, but I'm supposed to say we focus on results. Most importantly, we have country-led solutions and implementation. Quickly, sectors where we work. As I mentioned, our investments are based on the assessment of the greatest constraints to inclusive economic growth. So about a quarter of our most of our investments are in infrastructure. Our major grant programs, the compact programs, they range in size from, I think the smallest has been $62 million, the largest has been $700 million. And all that money has to be spent in 5 years. So that money is generally spent building stuff, building infrastructure. So about a quarter of our money has been spent on transportation, road, water, and air, 19% on energy, 15% on agriculture, 13% on health, education, and community services, and then 10% on water supply and sanitation. I don't know if anybody here is from Zambia or Mongolia or Jordan, but that's what their programs were focused on, was water and sanitation. And here's a map that's a little bit hard to read, but it shows everywhere that we work. We're currently working in 21 countries, either implementing programs or working with our partner governments to design programs that will hopefully, if they're approved by our board, be funded and implemented. So one of the biggest things that differentiates us from a lot of other organizations, because this is just how we work, is country ownership. MCC partner countries are responsible for the design and implementation of our programs. We have the MCA, we have each country establish generally it's a new organization, and we use shorthand of Millennium Challenge Account Nepal, Millennium Challenge Account Mongolia. We just call them MCAs. The MCAs are new institutions that are established by each country to implement the program that is funded by MCC. It's like I guess you could consider it a supercharged PIU, Program Implementation Unit, but it's a new agency that's set up to implement everything. Now that causes some challenges. Most countries that we're working in there's limited capacity to oversee and implement programs, especially programs of this size. When you're talking about a $500 million program that's going to be implemented in 5 years, that's normally larger than just about anything that the country has done in that time frame before. We also require these MCAs, these partner organizations that we work with, to learn MCC's policies and our procedures. We have very detailed rules that they have to follow. So we are basically standing up, helping the country stand up or start a new organization, and teaching them all sorts of detailed ways that they need to do things, while also trying to get things ready to spend hundreds of millions of dollars within 5 years. So in order to manage the risks of fraud and corruption, like I said, we have a lot of rules. The MCAs themselves, our partner organizations, they conduct almost all the procurements, and they manage almost all of the awards. This is different than, say, how USAID works, where USAID hires the contractors that do work in the field. The MCAs, these new organizations, are doing procurements and managing the contractors that implement the work. So that obviously introduces risks of fraud and corruption. They're not using they don't have the professional procurement teams and contracts and grants management teams that USAID has. They don't use the federal acquisition regulations. So MCC creates a number of rules. We require the use of standard procurement procedures. We have standard forms of contracts that the MCAs need to use to further help manage the risks. The MCC requires the competitive international hiring of firms that provide procurement and financial management services to the MCAs. So they're not conducting their procurements through the National Procurement Agency. They are normally hiring an international firm to run the procurements in accordance with MCC's program procurement guidelines. And we also do extensive oversight by MCC staff and consultants, which Sheepa is going to talk about in detail. The last thing that I do like to brag about a bit is that MCC has an anti-fraud and corruption policy. It has a very long name, but we call it the Anti-Fraud and Corruption Policy. If you go onto MCC's website, mcc.gov, and in the upper, what is it, right, left, right-hand corner, in the search bar, if you type in fraud, the first thing that comes up is MCC's AFC policy with the official title, which is MCC's policy on preventing, detecting, and mediating the risks of fraud and corruption in MCC operations, which is why we call it the Anti-Fraud and Corruption Policy, because that's a very long name. The AFC policy prohibits fraud and corruption. You think that that'd be obvious. It actually didn't prohibit fraud and corruption explicitly until 2018 when we noticed that it didn't prohibit fraud and corruption. It requires all recipients of MCC funding to report concerns of potential fraud or corruption, and it informs them how to report fraud and corruption to either the IG, because USAID's IG is our IG, or to MCC, or to both of us. So Sheepa is going to talk about the oversight.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Sheepa Nazirivela. So I work at the U.S. Embassy in Pristina in Kosovo with the Millennium Challenge Corporation Resident Country Mission. Thank you for staying this late. I know it's late. In my brain, it's 12 p.m. in Kosovo time. But we do appreciate, and we're going to have a lively discussion on the topics that we're touching upon. My part is going to be more programmatic, just to give you a glimpse into how MCC actually operates, how it operates on the country level. An example we brought to you today is the current Kosovo programs that we currently have, and I'm going to try to change this one. So just to touch upon some of the key points that Chris just mentioned, we have this different approach to how we work with countries, so country ownership. We have to partner with governments, and it's the government's duty to either establish an NGO that will implement our programs. Either it's going to be a PIU, Project Implementation Unit, within one of the ministries, Prime Minister's office, and so forth. But it's up to the government to make this decision. And in the very beginning, once the scorecard has been passed, basically the control of corruption indicator has been passed, then we enter into negotiations with countries. In the case of Kosovo, back in 2016, once the control of corruption indicator was passed, we entered into negotiations and we developed the so-called constraints to growth analysis. So it's a detailed assessment whereby we meet and we consult with all stakeholders from the private sector, public sector, academia, NGOs, and so forth. And based on this assessment, we come up with key constraints to growth. And in Kosovo's case, it was a lack of access to reliable electricity, which is the case even nowadays, and especially now with the war in Ukraine. And the second one is the perceived and real levels of widespread of corruption in Kosovo. When I say perceived, I'll make a note to that because we do have lack of access to data. These are the two key programs that we currently have in Kosovo, and compared to other donor agencies, compared to, let's say, USAID, we have a presence, we establish a presence only when we have programs. So once the program, the 5-year program is over, we also close the mission, the resident country missions. In Kosovo, as I said, based on the constraint analysis, then we build projects. So we have a project focused on energy sector, which is the majority of the portfolio, and also the rule of law, where we work with the prosecutorial counsel and the judicial counsel on digitization of cases in the so-called case information management system. The second program, compacts, usually are much bigger. They're focused on infrastructure. Is going to be specifically focused on energy sector because we rely a lot on coal and we're facing shortages during the winter. Just going back to what our responsibilities are. So we do provide funds to the government of Kosovo, but we do provide it through the MCA, basically through the implementing entity. And it has to be done on a quarterly basis. So each quarter, we call them quarterly disbursement requests. MCA has to prepare a request and say, this is the amount of funds we need, and it has to provide like a very detailed explanation of each of the activities. This is one of the ways we ensure that we have very hands-on oversight on the way how the funds are being planned, first of all, and also implemented. We have this process of so-called no objections. So basically, we're involved in every single step of the process, even the simplest terms of reference that has to be developed for the smallest activity, let's say shopping activity for a communications project, it has to go through us. So the MCA will send it to us, to MCC, and we have the so-called matrix organization where we basically have an expert from each of the areas serving in a country team. So we have one person from monitoring and evaluation, one person for gender and social inclusion, one for environmental and social impact, procurement, finance, and so forth. So all of them have to look at these TORs to make sure that we put a lot of hands-on prevention in order to identify corruption risks at the very beginning, even before the TOR or the RFP has been out. We have a say on that. If we see that there are corruption risks or what we identify fatal flaws, as we call them, then we have the right to say we don't approve this, and then MCA has to work through the TOR to address our concerns and then resubmit it. The same thing happens also with key staff. Once they apply for positions, we're involved as a monitoring, as an observer role. However, we want to make sure that people who are hired meet criteria and standards that are set by MCC. So we do have a say in case we find that one of key staff has applied and does not, or has a background, suspicious background, and so forth. I mentioned the programs. I'm just briefly going to give an example of how we tackle the anti-fraud and corruption. So once we have established the implementing entity, then we have the AFC, the anti-fraud and corruption team from DC, come to Kosovo and train all staff. When I say all staff, the all implementing entity staff, on what are the risks, what consists of corruption, what consists of fraud. Because I mean, for us who work in the sector, it's easy, we're used to these terminology, but most of the times when you talk to people, even in the procurement, they may not understand, or they may not perceive one particular act as fraud or corruption. And I'll proceed with, besides, once we have done the training, we ask each of the teams to develop a risk register. So basically, the process of corruption risk assessment that entails, first of all, doing an analysis of what the risks are. And then we go to the board. So the board of the implementing entity is usually composed majority of the government officials. I know it sounds a bit strange, an NGO monitored by the government. And then we also have the private sector and the NGOs. They have to approve it, and once it's approved, the anti-fraud and corruption plan is available on the webpage, and this is how the one we did for our threshold program looks like, and it's available online, it's accessible for everyone. On top of that, we made sure that we include the information on how to report fraud and corruption in their webpage as well. It's not enough to just include it on the MCC, but MCAs, implementing entities, also have to include this, and we asked them to run a social media campaign to make sure that since we do have a lot of procurements, especially in infrastructure, energy sector related, so that everyone is informed that we do take this seriously and that there are ways how they can report it anonymously. And I'll stop here. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. A few more slides, then we'll go straight to questions. On MCC oversight, a little bit more on MCC's oversight on MCAs. I don't know how many of you remember the 80s, but President Reagan taught us all a little bit of Russian, doveryai no proveryai, trust but verify. So we definitely follow that at MCC. We have a multidisciplinary country team of technical experts for every country. And those experts that work for MCC also have consultants who work for them, don't work for the MCAs, they work for MCC. And between the consultants and the staff, until there was a global pandemic, they were going to the countries every 3 to 4 months. And they're starting, we're restarting the tempo, we're increasing the tempo of the visits. But there are site visits on a regular basis. And we also require the countries, the MCAs, to have audits by competitively procured public auditing firms. Those audits are done every 6 to 12 months. It depends. That's a judgment call that MCC makes, depending on the country. We do monitoring evaluation of because we care about results. We actually do care about results. So does everybody else, but we do. The monitoring evaluation continues for years after program closeout. I was the country director that developed a program in Moldova from 2007 to 2010, and I was literally interviewed by evaluators last week on the results of the program that ended in 2015. They're working on their final report on the evaluation. And then we do retain the right to suspend or cancel part or all of a program due to fraud, corruption, or severe mismanagement or patterns of government action incompatible with MCC eligibility criteria. If funds are lost to fraud and corruption under one of our programs, in general, the country has to pay MCC back. And we've done that in a number of countries. The largest amount, I believe, was $7 million. Another was $1.5 million when a resettlement program was just terribly implemented. And it can go down to smaller amounts, but the countries do have to pay us back if they lose money. Last set of slides. Next, okay. So we do have, MCC does have an anti-fraud and corruption strategy. It's 5 pillars. I mentioned our AFC policy already. And the 2 things that I want to mention here are the mandatory training, the second pillar, and the tailored risk management program, the 4th pillar. So we do, as Shipe mentioned, we do have training. We require training for our counterparts in the MCAs. We actually also provide training for MCC staff that are involved in operations. MCC staff have to take this training every 2 years. It's 3 hours of training, 2 hours of listening to me talk about fraud and corruption, and 1 hour is a fraud awareness briefing by OIG staff. For the MCAs, we actually travel out to the country, except Cote d'Ivoire when we had a global pandemic. We deliver 14 hours of training over 3 half days. We go into detail of what the risks of fraud and corruption are in each stage of the project life cycle, from design to procurement to contract management to contract closeout. As Shipe mentioned, the training is mandatory for all staff. Oh, can I get the next slide, please? The training is mandatory for all MCA staff. We even have the director of the the head of the MCA attends. The MCC staff in country attend. We sometimes even have it opened by the chairman of the board of the MCA, who's often a senior government official. We make clear what MCC considers fraud and corruption. Again, you guys know what it is, but not necessarily everybody in the MCA. We have lots of discussions about conflicts of interest. But the most important thing, in my opinion, is we talk to them about how to create an anti-fraud and corruption risk register. We require all of our countries to go through a risk assessment process. Next slide, please. And this anti-fraud and corruption risk assessment process is meant to have the MCA staff, who are responsible for implementing the program, work with the MCC staff, who are technical experts in their fields with extensive international experience, to talk about what are the specific risks of this specific program of fraud and corruption in this specific country. Next slide, please. It's a standard risk assessment process. If you've ever gone through a risk assessment process, you talk about what the risks are, you determine, you make assessments of what the probability of it happening is, what the impact of it happening would be, and then you, based on that, you prioritize the risk. So if you have a risk that is high probability of occurring and a high impact if it does occur, then you definitely want to pay attention to that. These risk assessments, your typical, and we structure them, we go through activity by activity and sub-activity by sub-activity, and we talk about where could there be fraud and corruption. I tell them to put on their fraudster hats and imagine, if I wanted to steal money from this program, how would I do it? And we write it down and we say, okay, how are we going to stop that? And then based on that, these are very highly confidential. Not only are they not made public, I don't even share them with other countries because we want people to be honest. Frankly, in a lot of our countries, they didn't want to write down that the minister might try to tell the MCA who should get the $100 million road reconstruction contract. And they wouldn't want to write down that the local government officials would shake down might shake down works contractors who are building buildings in order to put the seal of approval when they do the inspections. They might want a little bit of extra money. They're not going to write that down if they think it's going to be public. So we keep this very confidential. However, we take the highest risks, we sanitize them a bit, and then the MCA, next page, the next slide, the MCA creates, as Shipe said, an anti-fraud and corruption action plan, which it becomes a public document and it identifies what the biggest risks of fraud and corruption are. It's both a transparency and an accountability mechanism because in principle, we try to revisit it every 6 to 12 months and have the MCA say what they have actually done in implementing their action plan. And that is it. These are the contact information for Shipe and me. We actually had a discussion beforehand. If people want a copy of the slides, just you can contact one of us. I think we agreed that everything in these slides can go out into the wild.
Our email address is not the hotline.
If any of you do have concerns about potential fraud or corruption, I should mention this, thanks. If any of you have concern about potential fraud or corruption, you can write, that's the hotline at mcc.gov. We have it set up so that if it comes to us, I get a copy of it, but a copy automatically goes to the Office of the Inspector General as well. And we accept, I think it's true of everybody, we'll accept allegations. If you don't want to identify yourself, we do accept the allegations. We just ask that you create a email address, like Washington Nationals fan at gmail.com. The Nationals did terrible this year, so it might be available. We just ask that if you do that, please monitor that email, because I'm actually interacting with several people. I have no idea who they are. But
they are feeding us information on allegations of fraud and corruption. We don't, I mean, eventually, if we do need to know who you are, then we'll have that conversation. But if you do think that there are any allegations, if there's anything that you think that any of us should know, any of the IGs should know, you can do that. You can create an anonymous email address. Believe me, they can't find out who you are. And we just ask that you, monitor that email address so we can write back and ask questions. And that's it for all the slides.
Great. Thanks very much, Justin Sheepa. And just before we go into Q&A, just one general term. I mean, everything on these slides is based and rooted in law or regulation or policy or the terms of, talk about terms of reference, terms of an award. And there is a real, legalese side to this. And so one takeaway I think that you all can, if you're coming from elsewhere, the U.S. has a very, as you can see, very robust and comprehensive network of authorities that allow for either OIGs or allow on the programmatic side to identify, detect, and respond to allegations of corruption. It's built into statute, it's been built into regulation, it's built into the grant or contract. When we see a loophole, and I see our audit leadership here is here, when we see a loop, some kind of, when we're conducting oversight of a particular program, and we see something that could be, as I said at the beginning, our mission is to safeguard and strengthen. So part of the strengthen is to put in, we don't create policy, but we certainly can identify to our agency, whether it's USAID or MCC, vulnerabilities where there could be some kind of loophole, there could be something that precludes our ability to access information or to receive information, or some requirement. For example, we had an audit in 2018 of USAID assistance through UN organizations or public international organizations, which identified that there was a lack of a mechanism to intake reports of fraud and corruption. There was a lack of that. Despite billions of dollars going through UN agencies, USAID just did not have strong enough controls to allow itself to respond to allegations that could compromise funding through the UN. So USAID responded to that report and created a whole new structure requiring disclosure of fraud and corruption allegations and sexual exploitation and abuse allegations by the involving program through the UN to report that to the agency, to the OIG specifically. So one takeaway is, in your home countries, if there are loopholes, if there are vulnerabilities, if there's something in, government contracts or grants or, civil society rules for government personnel, that there are opportunities to strengthen those, definitely lean into that. Lean into that because, it really does come back to a very legalese, what's in the law, what's in the regulation that is expected to be followed. So with that, let's, anyone have questions either in the audience or virtually, but we'll start within the audience. If you want to come up, I see a microphone back there.
Frederick's at the microphone.
Thank you so much. My name is Anderson D. Merman. I'm from Liberia, and I work for the chapter of Transparency International Liberia. USAID is a key partner to Liberia U.S. government and U.S. government, by the way, and we're also a key partner to the U.S. government. In fact, my being here is sponsored by USAID. I'd like to say thank you, especially to the MCC, for some of the efforts you've made in supporting development in Liberia. We had a compact in 2015 that ended in 2021, which largely helped to provide electricity access although during the period there were still problems here and there. People were complaining about the electricity corporation, the effectiveness and all of that. But to understand, the compact made impact. I have a couple of questions, but one is around engagement with civil society. You give 257 million. That's the value of the compact, the first compact to Liberia. And hearing everything you said, I haven't heard much around how citizens are actively involved with the process to take ownership of the compact. It's more like a government and MCC kind of engagement. I believe that MCC needs to do more to involve civil society in the process. 257 million is a lot of money. I hear all the different things you say about the structure you have here, the framework to monitor, but on the ground monitoring by civil society in the communities is extremely important. The things you wouldn't see sitting here in Washington or even the USAID or the MCC team in Liberia or any of the countries that you work will be seen in the communities. They will be seen by civil society. So again, all of what you've said, I haven't heard you saying anything about either a plan to incorporate something around providing support to civil society so that they do probably parallel monitoring or do extensive engagement around the program. I think you need to do that because we're talking about so much money here and not much I heard. Maybe you said it and I missed out on it, but I didn't hear anything much about citizens engagement so that they take ownership of the projects. You know, that's one. Then the other point is around the reporting. I heard a lot around NGOs or people who get USAID contracts to report. What about reporting by citizens also? And this is where the whole issue of citizens' involvement comes in. If the people do not know about what is happening, if they see it like a USAID or MCC and a government project, they wouldn't take ownership of it. They wouldn't engage with it much. So reporting by the public is important, probably because you don't engage much with them. That's why your reporting enrichment focuses on other USAID contractors and all of that. So how do you encourage people within the communities who are beneficiaries of these projects, in the case of electricity and all the different things, to report? That is important, and I'd like for you to consider that. Then the whistleblower protection, I'd like to hear a lot more about the package you have for whistleblowers. It's difficult for people to report. We run a system that allows people to report corruption. Sometimes there are apprehension here and there. So what do you have substantively as the package for whistleblower that will encourage people to report, and how guarantee I am that as a civil society, if I report corruption involving maybe USAID officials and all of that, I wouldn't be targeted, you know, as an institution. Thank you.
Great. Let me take the first part about reporting from civil society, and then let me punt it to Chris and Sheepa for the specific MCC question. Yeah, we talked about reporting from grantees, USAID-funded grantees and contractors. We also talked about reporting by employees who work for those organizations, and protections that do apply if they do choose to come forward. So, you know, again, just to recap in 15 seconds, you know, there are whistleblower protections that are available if an aid worker, if an employee of a contractor or grantee believes he or she has been retaliated against for making a disclosure to us. That actually triggers an entire OIG investigation, which is not pleasant for the organization that that person works for. And if it's a credible allegation of retaliation, we will investigate it. It doesn't matter if you're a U.S. national, if you're a Liberian, wherever you're from, that is something that if the allegation is retaliation, we will investigate it. We have to by law. There's no choice. It's by law. New law, 2016. We have to investigate it. Now, your question about civil society and like if you don't work for an organization, I mean, I think, you know, we've dealt with this issue with, you know, beneficiary people who are on the ground who are not employees of that aid organization, but who are on the ground, civil society or other individuals or beneficiaries, you know, recipients of foreign assistance. we're making active efforts to put forth, to amplify reporting mechanisms and to show, display or create a lot of visibility for our hotlines in different languages. We're about to publish a hotline that is in Ukrainian that we're going to distribute across the aid sector that, really identifies ways for individuals, for civil society organizations, for individuals to come forward to us. And like John said, there are confidentiality provisions in there where we may know your name, but we do not disclose your name, the fact, and we can contact you for further information. So, but that's key, that it's individuals, civil society organizations, aid workers from us, to come forward with allegations of fraud or corruption. So, but it is something we do need to lean into more so in getting our name out there, participating in events not just here in Washington, D.C., but across the world to amplify what our role is and protections that are afforded to those who do wish to make a complaint. So thank you for that question. Chris, you want to briefly touch the MCC side?
Yeah, sure. Thank you for the question. There is extensive outreach to at least parts of civil society. When we do the initial assessment of what the binding constraints to economic growth are, there is a lot of interaction with academia, with some NGOs. I don't think that Transparency International would necessarily be one of the ones that they consulted with. But we do have on each MCA there are a couple of members of the boards of directors that are representatives of civil society or the private sector. I don't remember how many there were in Liberia though, or what organizations they were with. In some MCAs, I don't remember if Liberia had one. There are things called stakeholder engagement committees that are adjacent to the board of directors, but I don't remember if Liberia had one. One thing that we do encourage or recommend that people do is that when they are doing construction, when contractors that are hired by the MCAs are doing construction, or if they're giving out benefits to beneficiaries, for instance, if they're doing a resettlement, that there should be information, something as simple as a poster saying, if there is fraud or if you think there might be fraud or corruption, this is how you report it. So that is fairly standard in our countries. The MCAs also do have websites to report, to post the reports on how the programs are being implemented. But obviously we can do better, or obviously the MCAs can do better to share information and to do outreach. This is something that we do strongly encourage. There is one complication in that when the programs are funded, when we sign the programs are basically designed. So if individuals or organizations recommend additional activities, basically the money's already been accounted for. But I will take this back to let our people in the field know, our members of our staff and the resident country directors, to remind them of the importance of outreach to the communities and using the local community to provide oversight. It just, in some countries, it's more robust than in others. I know in Moldova they had very robust stakeholder committees. There were committees when we rehabilitate. Sorry, I worked in Moldova, so I know this. We rehabilitated 93 kilometers of a highway, and each settlement, each village that it went through, there were committees of people that would meet on a regular basis with the leadership of the MCA. I attended one of those meetings when I happened to be in the country, and there were some issues with people were vandalizing the streetlights that we were putting in. And so they called a town hall meeting, and we talked about how it was important for them not to do that. And we did include in those cases, we were able to put in good guardrails and sidewalks for the roads. So around the edges, we can add to programs, especially if it's associated with the with safety. But I will take that back. Thanks.
Gentleman in the back. Yeah.
I think he was before him.
Oh, someone, okay, okay.
Yes, my name is Ernest Mpararo. I'm coming from DRC.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you very much from USAID. And the first point of view, it's USAID doesn't have any anti-corruption program in DRC.
USAID, sorry?
They don't found any anti-corruption project in Congo.
They don't fund anti-corruption projects.
Yes, because if, like us, we are working on anti-corruption, if I need US fund, I must have a US organization or US company which get your money and sometime come and fund us. But it's very, very difficult because I'm in touch with US Embassy in Kinshasa and USAID in Kinshasa. Now it's 10 years, we didn't have any fund on anti-corruption, but they are founding other things. And the big issues we have, it's lack of information. As you say, UN organizations, they get a lot of money, but we don't have any information. If the money is coming from US, if money is coming from European Union, from World Bank, we don't have any information. And then, and when you don't have information, it's very difficult to report or to monitor. So this is the first thing. I think the Office of Inspectorate General should ask all the recipients, all the institutions which get US fund to inform people, to inform the beneficiary. This is the first thing. The second thing is for MCC. I follow very, very well what he say, but you don't fear that Chinese will attract more African countries. If you see today in Ethiopia, Chinese, in Angola, Chinese, in DRC on mining issues is Chinese, in Tanzania is Chinese, in Kenya with railways it's Chinese. So with your procedure and rules and all paper people will fill, Chinese people doesn't ask all of these people. So that's why I think in most of our countries, the authorities went to Chinese than to US. So you don't feel this, or we know that Chinese doesn't care about corruption. Yeah, we know, because they come with bags and they corrupt, they pay bribe. But US policy is good, but on geostrategy, I think Chinese people our authorities will go there quickly then to come in MCC. So what can you do to avoid all of these issues? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for that question. I have a brief response with Gladys or John. Did you want to? Yeah.
You raised a valid point. We do realize that it's sometimes easier to go the easy route, the no paperwork, no accountability. But what we are hoping is the long term, we can make a difference, the US, because we are hoping that the impact that we have ultimately with the long term, when you have low corruption, as you've seen throughout this conference, they talk about long term, the countries that are have less corruption do well. And so we're hoping that that will be strong. But we do realize that there's this issue of visibility And we're well aware of it in the community, and we have been working with our agencies, for example, to note that. Because I know, for example, with the vaccines, right? Some of the hospitals where we have been, it's the U.S. government, DFC and USAID funded vaccines, all the signage is Chinese in the hospital, even though all the equipment is U.S. And there is a coordination, and as we've talked about, like we have different boards. The State Department's on the board, of DFC as well, USAID. We're trying to be more concerted because there are so many agencies in the U.S. that have their hand helping with this. We're all like, oh no, try not to step on each other's toes, but we have to have a more concerted message so we have more visibility. Because we don't want to put out a DSC flag or MCC flag or USAID flag when the State Department or all these agencies have been involved. And I think the U.S. being timid that way and trying to be considerate of other agencies is ultimately harming us, because China is one country. They don't have the different branches. It's one government. So it's a lot easier when you don't have, 10 cooks in the kitchen like you have here on this panel, for example, to just direct the way it's going to go. But that is something that is we're aware as a country, and as we are trying to find ways to counter that. But, the long-term lessons are already starting to happen with these easy money, easy projects. Ultimately, they're starting to be a few years deep, and they're coming to the U.S. and saying, okay, we have a couple where they've asked us to refinance a Chinese debt. And that's, it's a little politically difficult, as you can imagine, but there is I think the tide is starting to turn, and I'm hopeful it will continue as we continue to work with each other to find best practices and ways to show that we're the better deal. We're the good long-term deal. It may be easy, there'll be no paperwork, but later on, when the terms are changed on you, there's also no paperwork. And that is starting to be the problem. So we hope ultimately we will win.
Good evening. My name is Matt Aubrey. I run an NGO in the Bahamas called the Organization for Responsible Governance. And I have, I guess, maybe more 2 comments than questions. So building on what Anderson presented, I would point or offer that part of an effective anti-corruption strategy is the engagement of beneficiaries, stakeholders, civil society actors in the formative stages of program design. Too often it's packaged and presented and then commentary. And so not only does it make for more substantial and sustainable program development and the achievement for your initial intent, but I think it also positions and builds agency and ownership in that project, such that when it is developed, brought forward, it's going to have people who are more attentive and saying, this is what we talked about, it maybe doesn't look like this now, or we're seeing something off in that. So I think that is key. And on the USAID side, I think it's also important to note that when developing strategies, like a whistleblower strategy, I come from a country that has a population of 400,000. A whistleblower, effective whistleblower entity has to deal with the fact that people know who's involved. It's it's hard to develop a level of anonymity when there's that kind of informal information transfer. So to be effective, it has to obviously adapt to a context and encouraging involvement. So part of then I think what's critical is and kind of hedging the bet for the actualization of the programs that you're funding is seeding the environment to build a greater citizen involvement in these types of projects. So advancing in education on how to identify and critically analyze what infrastructure projects are to be, the process of what that is. Building just the concept of active citizenship and investing in that sets an environment that when you do execute a project, you have more attention, more investment, more understanding, and it ultimately creates greater local agency. So, thank you.
Thanks very much for those comments. Other questions?
Hello, everyone. My name is Chofiliti Vikoso, and I'm the board chair for Integrity Fiji. It is a national contact for Transparency International. Just wanted to understand more in the Pacific context. There's a lot of, and we thank USAID for coming in terms of humanitarian response, and we are in the forefront of fighting climate change, hence the reason why there's a lot of disaster cyclones. One of the key things just wanted to share was around, again, it goes back to what my two colleagues have shared around reporting mechanisms and how during humanitarian response work, there's not much due diligence is done, that people quickly just want to put out money so that response work is done on a timely manner. And many a times, if you go into these communities, you'll just see the USAID stickers everywhere, or t-shirts or banners without proper reporting or contact of how do you report back if something happened. In one of the recent reports, the Global Corruption Barometer study in the Pacific showed 38% of people who responded said they have been victims of sextortion. And I think this is maybe one of in the Pacific, people wouldn't have thought about sexual harassment during humanitarian crisis. But it's now began for Integrity Fiji to now start to explore how do we work with donors, especially around due diligence work, ensuring that their policies and process is in place before you give out the money, especially during humanitarian response. And I think there should be more working with national contacts or with your consulate to ensure there's more capacity building done during the preparedness phase so that when it comes to humanitarian response, they're ever ready. And they have processes in place should they encounter any of these problems, such as fraud or sexual harassment. I just wanted to share that comment. Thank you.
Thanks very much. And just, it's the focus on these conferences is anti-corruption, but one of the major other areas at our OIG, we do very much focus on sexual exploitation and abuse in the international aid sector, and that's an absolute, we talk about reputational risks with corruption, and an even greater reputational risk with what you've identified, and it's just absolutely grotesque behavior that we see in this field, and we're very active in responding to those allegations. And as far as capacity of organizations to protect USAID funds and before the awards, we're always looking at what is the agency looking at in what we call the pre-award stage, right? And doing its own USAID's due diligence over an organization's ability, and does it have mechanisms in place to detect, identify, and certainly report corruption and sexual exploitation and abuse before making the award. And depending on if it's humanitarian versus development versus global health, some of the awards have different mechanisms and terms in place. But something that we've continued to look at. There was in last year an audit on USAID's response to sexual exploitation and abuse in the aid sector, with some very key recommendations that the agency has taken on, most of them to strengthen their policies. Again, what we do is we inform the agency of deficiencies, areas where their policies could be strengthened, and that's one that we are absolutely continue to focus on, this issue.
I think there's a question there.
Let me go, if anyone else has,
Yes, over there.
if anyone had first, and then we'll come back. Miss?
Hi, thanks very much for the panel, very interesting. Lydia Nylander from the Enterprise Risk Management team from USAID. Good to see you, Adam.
Good to see you.
Couple of questions for Chris and Shilpa. So one question was just, I saw that you had due diligence consultants and independent engineers as part of the sort of technical assistance wraparound for staff. Are those typically consultants that are based in country, or are they coming from abroad? And then second of all, the risk assessments that are done, are you doing any sort of ex post factor evaluations or any sort of just overall evaluation of what those risk assessments are telling you, recognizing that you sort of have these 5-year time frames. I'm just curious about sort of enterprise risk in that context. So wondering if you could maybe share something on that. Thanks.
Okay. So yes, the due diligence and independent engineers that that MCC uses to help oversee the work that the MCA is running, those are generally they're hired by MCC, so they're hired through using the federal acquisition regulations. They're not all American companies, but a lot of them are, and they're generally pretty decent-sized consulting firms. And sometimes they will field teams from basically all over the world, and sometimes they do have local subcontractors. They normally, I'm just thinking about Morocco. They do have a local subcontractors that they can field. That's basically how we did a lot of the oversight during the pandemic. Not that the pandemic's over, but particularly when nobody could travel, our independent engineers had local subcontractors that were in country already and could go there. They're not there on a daily basis, but they can reach in and use local resources. So it's not just people flying in from Washington or Chicago or Canada. We do have some Canadian firms as well. On ex post evaluations of what the risk assessments tell us, it's more of we do see, well, our focus is on, we do have just general enterprise risk management approaches, and so our technical staff, for instance, our water and sanitation people, are looking at things all over the world and our experiences on our other water and sanitation projects. Our focus is on, we have a particular focus on the risks of fraud and corruption. To be honest, I think that, it's my job, so you're not going to be surprised to hear me say this, but I think that taking a little bit of time for the project staff to think about and write down what the risks of fraud and corruption for their particular projects is, I think that that's a useful, that's a good use of time. Because if they're not thinking about it, well, they may miss opportunities. Without having a structured process to do it, even if it only takes a small amount of time, without taking a structured approach, it's like risk management. I was involved in enterprise risk management at MCC a couple of years ago, and I would tell our staff when we would talk about it, everybody does risk management every day. That's what your job is identifying what the problems are going to be and how to address it. But there's a difference in taking a structured process, step by step, and that can help you identify issues that might not be top of head, but when you take a structured approach, you might think, oh, what about that? So what we do is this whole anti-fraud and corruption risk assessment process is run by me and some consultants that work for me and some dedicated people at our MCAs and in our resident country missions. And we do share information. I'm aware of all the allegations of fraud and corruption that come into MCC, and we build that into our training. We sanitize everything, so we don't say that something happened in Liberia or in Moldova, but we say here are some situations that happen. To make people aware. In fact, we have an internal announcement that's coming out Friday, International Anti-Corruption Day, which we do every 6 months. That goes out, it's internal, but goes to all our staff, and it says, we received X number of allegations in the past 6 months, and here are 8 sanitized versions of the allegations that we received and what we've done. So it's not a formal, I just said taking structured formal approaches is important. It's not a structured formal approach of going back and seeing how the anti-fraud and corruption risk assessment did in identifying the risks of fraud and corruption, but we do
feed in the experiences in our various countries, the allegations that we receive. While I don't share the risks of fraud and corruption that are identified, say, in Liberia with Moldova, I have all that information. I participate in, and my consultants participate in those discussions. So that's part of our job, is say, did you think about this? Because we saw this in those countries. So that's generally how it works, is through the involvement of the anti-fraud and corruption team in the anti-fraud and corruption risk assessment process. We bring in the up-to-date, not up-to-the-minute information on what risks of fraud and corruption we've seen that we're aware of, either because we've read about it in the world or because we actually got an allegation about it from a specific country.
Okay, I think we are at time, but thanks very much to our esteemed panelists. Thanks to the audience, both in person and online. Really hope you got some good takeaways to bring back from this session about Office of Inspector General, about Millennium Challenge Corporation risk assessments and response to fraud and corruption. And please, take down the information we've provided on the slides. And we absolutely support this conference and the mission on transparency, accountability, and responding to allegations of corruption. Thanks very much, everyone.